Buongiorno, mi amici. Thought I'd open with a little Italian. Good day, my friends, and thank you for joining me here on the show. I've got two amazing guests for you today. You know, the other day I was talking to my good friend, John Donvan of Intelligence Squared Debates, former ABC News correspondent, co-author of In a Different Key, which is now out as a documentary soon. And John said he never misses an appearance of Bill B. Bill Boyle joins me today, so I guess that means John Donvan will be listening, and hopefully he'll join me soon. Also, very excited to have Nayyera Haq back on the show. It's been way too long since she joined me. She is and was brilliant as always. I think you're going to love both those conversations. But before I get to them, got to tell you again about what happened late last night here in my town of Clarkstown, New York, where Val and I have raised our daughters. We won both open seats in a horribly contentious, terribly damaging Board of Education campaign. We built a really organized group of people, and we beat a powerful movement, which is also fairly organized, which I think was filled with hatred and corruption and conspiracy and divisiveness and screaming and name-calling and actual committing of crimes. It was bad. But I got to say, we did it by organizing and turning out the vote and stood on the shoulders of our fathers, our mothers, those who came before us and did the similar kind of work to create positive change in their own community. And I got to say, I'm proud of the work that I've been involved in over my life and my career. I'm proud of all the amazing movements and initiatives and efforts to make the world a better place that I've been somehow involved in. But this was personal. It wasn't close to home. This was my home. The people I met along the way taught me so much and inspired me in so many ways. I've got so many new friends. Hello, new friends that are also now listening to the podcast as well. We elected two good men, John Malpe and Brian Montez, to the Board of Education. But the campaign was almost entirely run by amazing women. And I've always tried to be the change that I want to see in the world. And I haven't always been able to do it. But that's my mantra. That's the code that I live by. But this was exactly that. And I think that if you want to see real change, feel genuine purpose, make new friends, and build a better future for your home, then now is the most important time to get involved locally. And I'm telling you, if you don't stand up, I promise they are going to. They're just going to make up things that aren't even happening in your kid's school, in your town, and divide people over them, and you won't even have time to react. You don't want to wake up one morning and find out your school isn't teaching science anymore, and you're holding the last copy of George Orwell's 1984, that they're banning books. The time to stand up is definitely now. Hope is alive. You're the one we've been waiting for. I've got a great show for you, but I really just wanted to say that. I posted most of what I just said on Facebook. If you want to share it and tell your friends to listen to the top of today's show, because more than anything else, I've been inspired by listeners of this show to get involved, to be the change I want to see. So many of you are actually doing it. If you aren't, there's no obligation. There's no responsibility. But I'm trying to convince you to do it because it matters. It makes a difference, and it'll make a difference in your life. Also, want to say here at the top, before I get to Nayyera Haq and then Bill Boyle, that major change coming to this podcast. I'm really excited to make some new announcements, but let me just say briefly, I am planning on dropping the traditional news segment, the segment that I've been doing here on the show, and I want to know what that would mean to you. I am terrified that I will lose subscribers if I do it. If I stop doing the news dump every day, the last 24, if I stop doing that, I'm afraid people are they're gonna cancel their subscription because that's why they subscribe, or they're gonna lower their subscription because they pay me more because they think I do more work and they get more of their news from that segment or something. I'm terrified to lose you as a subscriber as a result. I'm begging you to hang on for at least another month or more if that's someone that you would be in that category. I mean, we've got almost 800 paid subscribers, but we got to get to 3,000 to be able to sustain this. And here's the thing. What I'm going to replace it with is going to be pretty cool, really unique, and I think very positive. Because here's the truth as well. I think what I've been doing with the news segment, to some extent, betrays my own sense of ethics and purpose, because I think the 24-hour news, being connected to news, too connected to knowing everything that happens, it's not necessary, and it's depressing. And it makes it harder to do other positive things and create positive change in your own life, with your own sense of yourself, whatever you might be struggling with internally, and in the world and your community. I think all of that news can be so depressing and so disenchanting and so frustrating that it makes you not want to take action. And so what I want to do is something more positive when I replace it with, I hope, something that focuses on the community that we built. I think it's time for a change here on the podcast. I think I might even have an extra guest some days. I want to talk with people who not only can help us understand what is happening in the world and what, if anything, we can do about it, but people who can help us live better, healthier lives with less suffering, less stress and anxiety and depression and concern about the future and the uncertainty that is unfolding before us at such a rapid pace. Those are the types of guests that I want to have, like one of my favorite podcasts, 10% Happier, and so many more. So we'll continue to have all of your favorites, and I'll introduce you to new people who are going to make each and every one of our lives better, I hope. I'm sure of it. I know it. So thank you very much for listening to this. I'll elaborate on it more on tonight's Hangout for those of you who are paid subscribers. I hope to see you tonight at 8. But for now, the opening news segment is on the bench. It's on the shelf. And what does that mean to you? Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. And just one final note about it. Not only do I not think the news segment was good for you, it was killing me. It was so much work. It was 4 to 6 hours late into the night every night, maybe more. And I had to be plugged in all the time, and I could never get away from it. And now I'm going to do so many other things here, including putting out more video on all the social media apps, which will help grow the show. And for those of you that like it, you'll be able to watch so much of the interviews. And I'm going to have more time in my life to focus on me and my family and my health. It was too much. I'm in here in the shed every night. Maybe I have a couple drinks. Maybe I smoke weed because it helps me focus on taking someone's ums and ands out of their interview. The bottom line was, it's too much. So many of you were trying to understand how I was able to do that. And I'm telling you, I wasn't. It's over. I can't. So even if I lose everybody that subscribes for the news, it'll have to be worth it, because I have to be healthier. And that's the choice for me. So I hope you stay with me. I hope that you will be excited about what is to come and what I'm replacing that news segment with. And if you have ideas, send them along. Standupwithpete@gmail.com. Also, thank you to Pete Coe for talking this out a little bit with me, especially. And some people might wonder about what might happen with the jingles. Pete, this was partly his idea. He's always worried about me, and there's no doubt that he will be an integral part of the show, doing all kinds of voiceover work and helping me develop it as well. Love the guy, really smart, very cool guy. Also talked to my brother about this. Of course, David Campbell, John Donvan, and Bill Boyle, who also said, I don't think you'll lose one subscriber. Tina Winsett also told me that. So thank you guys very much. I really want to crowdsource this show and how it's produced. I always want to hear from you. I always ask you before I make any kind of changes like that. That is what I'm doing. I hope to see you tonight at the Hangout. And now let's get to my guests. Sorry for rambling on so much. Coming up, the great Bill Boyle, one of our better conversations. We did something fun, which is something else I want to do. We reacted to some sound clips, and specifically Steve Bannon and also Will Cain and Dave Rubin. So that was very interesting. You're going to love my conversation with Bill Boyle. But first, I met her when we were both on Real Time with Bill Maher for the first time. I think she's been on it since at least one more time. I've yet to get invited back, but she's a television radio host. She hosted a nightly newscast and was a foreign affairs correspondent for the Black News Channel. She publishes in outlets as varied as The Daily Beast, The Washington Post, Refinery 29, The Root. She previously served as a senior director in the White House and senior advisor at the State Department, advising our nation's top leaders on issues of international security and diplomacy. She's a really good friend and has been a mentor to me, and she is amazing in a conversation like the one I host here on Stand Up. And I reached out to her. We talked before and after about her doing more and being on more. She's got little kids, and we'll see, because I'd love to work her in the show as often as I can. She's awesome on Twitter, by the way. You should say hi to her and thank her for joining me at Nayyera, Nayyeraoar. Look it up in the show links if you didn't catch that. And let's do it right now with Nayyera Haq. Oh my gosh, there she is. Nayyera Haq. What is it about you, or what is it about me that I haven't had you on like every week? When the last time you were on, people are like, why isn't she on all the time? And my response was, she's super busy. But I am so excited to see you and talk to you. Thank you.
I love when you reach out, Pete. The first time we met, we had a lot of fun. And I think every time we talk, we do. And I'd like to do more of it. And it's convenient that that thing that was keeping me so busy just like poof away. And that was the Black News Channel. Great experience and opportunity. But yeah, that was just a 1-year massive experiment. And now this whole situation used to be a home studio. And now it's just my attic again.
Well,
regular attic.
Let's just talk about being Black News Channel in terms of corporate media, in terms versus, what we're doing now, independent media. You're also at SiriusXM a couple days a week, and you may fall into some other major network. But the bottom line is they may not be long for this world. Like, I wasn't somebody who piled on the failure of CNN Plus because I thought it was a worthy endeavor. Clearly, it was managed poorly. But the future of companies like CNN or NBC or any other is probably not super profitable because of how fragmented media is, because of things like Substack and Patreon and what I'm doing, podcasts and YouTube. What do you think about where corporate media is? You've worked at all of the major outlets, and where do you think it's going?
Cable is not long for this universe. Now, people do still like network, but the idea of cable and all the channels that people were paying for and the opportunity they had with streaming, right? So many people. I mean, I was a cable host that did not have cable at home. We, used some other way to access the ability to watch what I was doing. So that tells you right there in a nutshell how people get their news, and they get it on digital, right? They're not getting it on that linear platform anymore. Just why you saw CNN Plus trying to take the hosts and the personalities and the journalism from cable and maneuver it for a digital landscape. The challenge, though, is that you don't make money in linear anymore. Now, there's a solid audience there. It tends to be 65 years and older. And what BNC was betting on was that there is a slightly younger audience that is very interested in issues that are very specific and through the lens of Black people and people of color. And that there's a white audience that wants to hear that also, right? So that there's an intersection there. And we told news. I did news twice, every night for 2 hours. I did morning TV. I did all sorts of storytelling that came from the lens of the insurrection is an insurrection. We didn't dance around what it was called, that voting rights are under attack, and that this is a moment of renewing the idea of American rights and democracy. That was so much fun to do, but the money ultimately wasn't there to do it because it was cable, and all of our voices relied on a corporate investment. So when the corporate investment on one end tanked, they made up for it by pulling the plug on BNC. And that's our story. That's why I have more free time today than I did before. But it was a truly great experience to just see storytelling and news gathering from a different starting point, right? Like if your starting point is truth and justice, you end up in a different place at the end of a 5-minute segment. At the end of a show, you're not debating what is real and what is not anymore.
Well, let's get into one of the issues you certainly would have covered if you were on BNC today or over the past few days, which you are covering, I'm sure, on SiriusXM, and I'm sure you're being invited on several different types of shows to talk about, which is the horrific shooting in Buffalo. And what we call it matters. And before I hit record, you basically gave President Biden credit for how he handled his comments and what he called it. What is it called, and why does it matter?
White supremacy, right? Those words matter. And hearing the president of the United States, specifically a gentleman of a certain age and era, acknowledging the reality of America today, right? That the battles of the civil rights movement may not look the same, but they're still here in a different form. That is what at stake. And so hearing the president of the United States, hearing that his first Black press secretary, the first Black secretary ever, all were in Buffalo acknowledging the reality of the current American experience was deeply meaningful, right? Words matter. They carry weight. They also carry weight, not just personally, because I'm a part of a biracial family, but also legally, calling it domestic terrorism. Congress trying to pass a domestic terrorism law that allows the Department of Justice to explore this. Now, people don't realize that in the Trump administration, the FBI had a division that was focused on right-wing extremism. And within that bucket, you had militias, you had white supremacists. The Trump administration shut it down in its first year. That was all of that narrative and messaging we heard about the real threat is Islamist radicalism, Islamist terrorism, right? And at that point, they said those words mattered. Why don't people call it out? Well, fast forward 5 years, the threats to Americans are increasing. We have had far more racism and racially motivated violence than anything else. That is the current threat. So we need to call it out and we need to name it. And according to what Republicans were saying 5 years ago, name it, make it illegal, and pursue it. And in this case, it happens to be white supremacist, right-wing terror based out of militias, based online. I will lay blame on the theories espoused on certain channels, but at the end of the day, this is about how our young men engage online, and when they're playing video games, whether they're surfing different internet sites, the type of hate that they get, and they are being targeted and molded in real time. So, you know, I'm talking to you through a computer right now. Other people are talking to our children in the same way. I think that it is incumbent upon white families to make sure they know what their children are doing online and talking to them about what they're receiving. The parents of the shooter said, we don't know what happened. We know that he was really paranoid and scared about COVID. It's probably COVID. Like, you clearly do not understand what is happening. It's sad, but that sadness and your inability to navigate your own house and the inability for society writ large to name it and call it out and address it resulted in 10 people, Black people, losing their lives just because they went grocery shopping.
Yeah. You make so many points there. Let me just ask about a couple. Such a good point about the fact that for years, I forgot about this in a way. Everybody on the right, media and in Congress and so on, was saying, call it what it is. Islamist terrorists. Say the word. Say they are an Islamist. Say they are a Muslim terrorist. Why can't you say the words? I think it might have come up in debates. It was certainly questions were asked to the president, whoever it was, President Obama, for sure. Why not call it what it is? It was constant, that refrain. Say the words, as if that was going to, as if it mattered. Well, if that mattered, then it consistently matters here. Use the same words. So that's I think that's what you're talking about. But the video game thing is interesting. I know I saw you had tweeted about that. What is happening? What do you mean? Like, are white kids or kids are playing video games, and it's not the game itself, right? But there's a conversation. There are people all over the world playing these video games on the internet, and you're talking to them and they're saying certain types of things. Is that what it is?
Essentially, right? You're plugged in at home into a broader community, right? So it's the equivalent of, at one point, maybe all the boys used to come and hang out in your basement. You could vaguely hear what was going on downstairs. Well, now you can't vaguely hear it because it's all happening through the internet. But the conversations that are happening are not by accident. There are groups organized online. They are the virtual extension of the militias that we are seeing in real life space. They organize, they talk about white solidarity. And listen, I get wanting to own your identity, but the challenge we see is that it turns into your identity is being threatened. Therefore, you now need to go do something about it, right? It's the idea that you are under threat. That threat needs to be met with violence. That's the idea of the great replacement theory. And I don't laugh at that as much as wonder, right? When we're talking about the logical consistency or the lack of logical consistency in so many of these things, like, well, why are you so worried about being a minority? Like, is it bad to be a minority in America? Like, are you worried about being treated the way you might be treating other people, right? Like that to me is at the heart of the anxiety about replacement theory. But that's the conversation. Like, you'll be online and you'll be plugged in and you hear people talking about this. My brother-in-law, who is Black, is a gamer, and he talked about certain games or times of the day he had to unplug because he's just like, I can't casually hear the N-word. Yes, I enjoy the shooter game, but it's overwhelming, and it's these white boys just casually using the N-word all the time. So it's a level and type of conversation that we would not accept or tolerate in real life.
Man, I love talking to you, or rather even just listening to you. Your family, who did your family replace when they came to America?
Potentially some doctors that went to the Vietnam War, because that's when my dad was recruited to come to the United States.
Do you know the name of the family of doctors? Was it the Hendersons?
Possibly. Whoever, left from that hospital in Brooklyn, got drafted to Vietnam. My dad came and replaced him. And then my husband's family, they replaced paid labor and were slave labor.
Okay, well, now there goes the joke. So, I'm not laughing at that one.
But like, for real though, I'm kind of like all these people that we talk about. I'm like, my husband's family actually probably was one of the first, like lineage wise, probably got here earlier than all of these white Americans, right? Like, I'm saying air quotes of like who we define as white because 100 years ago, Irish people weren't considered white, but now they are, right? So like, he actually did come here before all of us.
Yeah, no, I wasn't sure.
That's not right. That's not considered American in that way.
Yeah, I wasn't sure his lineage. I was going to ask about it, but who knows when his family came here. So, but that's absolutely right for any Black people whose ancestors were brought here against obviously their will and enslaved generations of. So when I want to just get your, I'm trying to ask every person I can that comes on the show and listeners how you felt and how you are feeling, not only as a result of the horrific targeted shooting in Buffalo, but as everyday racism. Every day, it's, you see these videos that go viral of people doing and saying racist things. And my reaction to that is usually, what percentage of everyday racism did that represent? That's just the one someone filmed and shared and got to me. But ask anybody of color, and if they're paying close attention and keeping a list, they could probably give you several. And so how are you guys doing? How is your husband doing? How are you doing? You're a brown skinned woman. Your kids are, as you said, biracial. And so how do you emotionally comprehend? How do you deal? How much are you affected? How much do you talk about it with your husband and others?
I mean, it's a constant topic of background conversation, right? Like it's ever present. We're very aware of who we are and how we go through the world. I will say this. Obviously, I go through the world a little differently than, my Black husband. And I do wonder when he's jogging in our nice suburban neighborhood, what people are thinking. Do they recognize that he actually lives here and owns a house here? Or are they going to, try to question him and his ability to be here? So that is something I would love to protect him from that, right? Because I love him, but and I like to protect the people I love, but that's just reality. He has come back a few times as he's gone through the neighborhood and said, no, I see that Black Lives Matter sign in front of their house, and that's nice, but do they actually know any Black people? Like, that's great, but when it comes to being in a room, right, where people look like you and me, Pete, and somebody makes a comment, how many of us actually are like, that was kind of racist, you shouldn't say that? And I feel like 20 years ago, we wouldn't say anything in the name of civility. But now we're keenly aware of that. Yeah, the civility protects the bad actor. What about the civility of protecting the people who are the victims? And so I think people like you and me would handle that differently now. And that's a good thing. That to me is progress. But it's those tiny moments, call them microaggressions or everyday racism, like you just called it. That's the day-to-day change.
The kind of
because
thing.
Not everybody can step up and change the fact that a police officer dragged somebody out of a car, or that the charges levied on, somebody like my husband were different than something levied on a 15-year-old white boy. doing the same exact thing. I can't change that every day, but I can change what people accept and tolerate in the spaces where I go.
So well said. And I appreciate that insight into your life. And I run whenever I want. I wear whatever I want. I don't worry about a thing. Mm-hmm. And I try not to take it for granted. What I find myself,
I'm convinced in my Tony suburban neighborhood, which by the way, totally moved here for good public schools. Cause that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
And then quickly realized that we kind of stick out a little bit. I am convinced that the days that I've had off, which are a lot right now, that when I go to the playground with my daughter, that people think I'm the nanny. Because I don't wear Lululemon pants and I don't have blonde hair.
Well, why don't you just assimilate and why don't you color your hair and get some fucking Lululemon pants? What's wrong with you? What you want to attract? You don't need any trouble. What do you just?
There's definitely certain brands that I've noticed that signify certain things, and I'm like, okay, so. Is it the FUBU or am I doing the Tory Burch? Which way am I going?
That's interesting. I wonder, right
now I've just settled on Old Navy. I feel like that's universal and I can handle that.
Yeah. Well done. Good choice. So I wanted to ask you about, solutions and how we address this stuff. And I think one of the things you talk about your schools, is at the local political level. And of course, that I've been involved in our local BOE election.
And thank God you have been, Pete. I was so happy to see that because I look at that and I'm like, that's it right there, right? The idea that education is such a battleground is because it's about training the next generation. And even in my New York City public school system, which is supposed to be multicultural and multi-ethnic and all the things and progressive, my small town community in there taught us that the Civil War was about states' rights. We vaguely maybe heard about slavery, and it was just oh, wait a second. That was kind of what they meant by state rights, right? But that was an evolution of history storytelling. It wasn't just the straight up, no, they made an economy based on forced labor, and that's what they wanted to protect. But we couldn't even tell that truth. And so now I see, frankly, the whitewashing of history. And I wonder, right, where do we go? And so where we go is that this is the battleground, right? We make sure that there is truth and common sense and history taught in our schools so that children know how they got where they are today. So there's no surprises suddenly when you go to college or you go out into the world at 20, you're like, whoa, wait a second. There's a whole thing I didn't know about. I think our generation is different than older generations where I know my parents often, particularly when it came to how hard pregnancy and things are, would very much be we don't want to, it's too difficult. If we tell you this, you're not going to want to deal with going through life that way. And it's no, I believe we should tell the truth and we should equip ourselves and our children to be resilient and how to deal with it. Yes. So I think kids can handle a lot more than we give them credit for. But actually the parents in these small communities who are sensible need to step up and start engaging in their communities again. Those of us who trusted the system and we just let it operate. And the ones who didn't were the ones who were trying to change it for the last 20 years. And unfortunately, they've succeeded. Yeah.
And if you moved into a neighborhood like we did, and it sounds like you did, for the schools, it tends to be the whole we moved into the neighborhood for the schools is basically code for saying we moved into a more affluent neighborhood because the schools are ranked in different ways. But it's all tied into property taxes, generally speaking. And so the bottom line is all of those schools in more affluent areas, even if they're middle, upper class areas, much less very affluent areas, they are all now battlegrounds. Steve Bannon is trying to run the board, as well as plenty of others that are organized as hell. So your school will become a place that will be hostile for not only, by the way, people of color. We focus way too much on race, but for LGBT kids.
The idea of science.
Better example.
Even the idea of science, right? The word, it's only a theory. I'm do you understand? In order for something to be considered by the scientific community as a valid theory, 99.9% of scientists have agreed on it. We've even taken the word theory and watered it down to, it's just, no. Most people are talking about a hypothesis. A theory is something that you can back up with evidence, and literally the only thing missing is that you haven't physically seen it happen in action, but everything else around it, you've been able to prove. So I think just the basic understanding of how scientific inquiry works is one of our challenges, right? Because everybody can be an expert. Just Google, right? The idea that do your own research. What research even means isn't mean that you went and found a piece of information. Research is peer reviewed and tested and tried and questioned before people accept it as valid.
I hate do your own research. I absolutely hate it. I'm all for critical thinking. I'm all for being responsible, but we don't know how to do research. So what I'd like to say is make friends with a scientist.
Yes. And
just ask her a question of what she thinks. Find a scientist in your community, in your family, or a doctor, and ask them. And most of the time, whether on these controversial issues like vaccines or climate science, the vast majority of them are going to be on the same page. Don't look it up.
Just the idea of controversy, there's actually no scientific controversy. It's just whether or not people want to listen to what experts have to say. That's the controversy.
Yeah, for the most part, for sure. All right. You are one of those people when I talk to on or off air, I can talk to you about anything, and you're always super smart. You're like Jason Johnson or Wajahat Ali or Laura Coates, so many other people that I love to talk to. And so that means I abandon segues and hit on as many issues as I can. And now I want to do that by talking to you about the WNBA star, a woman who is considered one of the best basketball players in the world, Brittany Griner. She has been imprisoned in Russia, where she also played a lot because, you can't make enough money playing in one league as a professional female athlete, apparently, is my understanding. And so, and it's fun. Why not? Go keep playing. She should be able to do whatever she wants. Apparently, she was detained for having a cartridge, like a marijuana cartridge, which, it's hard to believe that that's a crime anywhere, much less certainly she wasn't. Anyway, it doesn't matter why she was detained. She's detained, and you have a lot of thoughts about that. And I have not talked about it with a guest, I don't think. So hit it.
So many thoughts about that. So Brittany Griner is actually the star of the WNBA, the Phoenix Mercury, right? So she makes less than a starting player anywhere in the men's league, in the NBA itself. So she's capped, and that's the star player. So in the offseason, her and all the other WNBA players, and I'm glad that you called her one of the best basketball players in the world, because hands down, she's better than most of the men in the league right now, right? Just by definition, if she's the best in hers. That's hard for some dudes to understand. I love when dudes just try to roll up on WNBA players and like, hey, you want to play a game of pickup? And it's like, what are you doing? She's a professional basketball player. I digress. But she's been in and out of Russia for the last 10 years, helping win games for Russian teams. And Vladimir Putin loves, right, showing off Russian sports teams, and shows she's been a critical part of that, definitely been on his radar. And conveniently, just days after Russia rolled into Ukraine and the United States and European allies did what they said they were going to do, which is hold Russia accountable, she was detained. Now, all we have is video of her going through the airport security metal detector and getting pulled aside. Now, the Russians allege that she had a marijuana cartridge. Listen, that cartridge could have been anything. It could also not even exist. We don't know. But they allege that. And in Russia, marijuana possession is 10 years. This goes back to Putin back in 2013, made a big speech to the international body that's about combating drug trafficking and blamed the moral decline of the West, right? The acceptance of soft drugs like marijuana as one of the fundamental differences between the US, Europe, and Russia. So it takes an issue that he already was harping on. He also has criminalized homosexuality. She's also Black, right? She's Black, gay, and now supposedly a weed smoker. So he found in her all of the things that he could attack about American identity and Western decline, and now he effectively has her hostage. So we saw her just last week pop up in court with Russian lawyers as her defense. Now, in speaking with Brittany BG, it's what folks call her, BG's counsel, they do feel like she is well represented by these Russian lawyers. And her jail sentence was extended for another month. So that's 4 months in prison without even getting a trial date. There was a U.S. Marine in prison for 2 years in Russia who came back to the United States, was exchanged for a Russian drug trafficker in U.S. prison. His parents were at the White House They spoke at his release and said that Brittany Griner must be freed. She is a high-profile celebrity hostage, different than these intel guys, right? Because she's not even being accused of espionage or violating any international norms.
Right. That's a good point.
She was part of that idea of sports diplomacy, that the world could rise above all of these political tensions through playing sports. And so now Putin has undermined even that. So keeping an eye on her, it's an unjust detention, but the reason why she was there seems very American. Couldn't make equal pay.
Oh my God, you're good at this. Do you write ever?
I talk a lot.
I know, but like
that's why we do radio, Pete.
I know, but you're a lot fucking better than I am. That's for dish. Sometimes when you're talking, when you do this for a living and you do it with other people, you just kind of like I remember we almost should do this like every time we talk, but it'll probably get boring for listeners. But like I remember when I got booked on Real Time, and they told me who you were, and of course I looked you up, and I was pretty well prepared, but it was the worst situation because I didn't need to be there because you were there, but I was like at the same time I'm gonna say stuff, but it did feel like I was trying to play basketball next to Brittany Griner, and I was like, what are you doing? And then it was just always so. Whenever you're talking next, you're almost like, there's no need.
Listen, you got me. You gave me a lot of radio reps. You let me fill in for you. I mean, you've always been very good about taking those of us who are just trying to get heard and giving us a space to be heard. I mean, listen, the people you just mentioned as very smart people, all four of us, people of color who, don't have the daily hosting gig, and you give us time and space for that. So we like you.
But it's also an example of, I mean, truly, and I'm not being, what's the word, magnanimous or phony or whatever. Like the reason why I've had for me, my comedy career certainly counts, but even within comedy, as a white guy, I get way more reps, way more opportunities. So when I walk in the door at a network and they give me a show, there's no doubt that it has a lot to do with just the fact that I'm a white guy. It's traditional. It's this, but it doesn't mean, it's whatever that cliche is about how much harder, say, black folks have to work. It was just so evident. It's evident in this conversation with you. It's evident when I talk to so many other people of color, how unbelievably brilliant they are and how in depth they can go on these issues where I can't. I just can't. I'm fucking brilliant and hilarious for a minute and a half on 90 seconds that no one wants to. Now it's just bullshit. Anyway, so.
But I will. Okay, so the other thing about that, Pete, is the idea of what you do with that space, right?
Sure,
right?
Yeah.
The conversations you can have, who you can bring to the table. And I will bring this back to sports because I've been on a bit of a bugaboo because I can barely throw a ball, right? Like,
why is that? Why is that?
And
what
so
happened
for
to
me,
you?
for my kids, I got the you need to learn gymnastics and dance. And I'm like, I would have actually loved being part of a team sport. Like, I think it's great. All the stuff that you learn being part of a team, resilience, how to lose, how to win, how to play as a team, all of that. So it's a big deal for me, for my kids, boy and girl, to learn how to play team sports, again, just to have a skill. So I wasn't given that. I was given a very traditional, stereotypical girl experience in that way. But as I watch and read more about sports and just try the curiosity around it, and I see the inequity there, it's not the same thing in soccer, right? So we just had today a huge deal announced between U.S. and men's, the national soccer teams. Now, the national teams are a little different than, say, the corporate teams, right? Because the NBA and WNBA are about profit making. The national teams, yes, they make money, but ultimately they're technically nonprofits. They're technically all about advancing the sport. But we all know, like, the women's soccer team wins. American women's soccer, they win. Yet the men's team loses and they were making more. And FIFA, the international body, just refuses to pay them equally, right? So the men's team made a deal with the women's team. U.S. Soccer made a deal and announced it today saying that the men would take their winnings, their bonuses, their World Cup, whatever they got, their winnings, put it in a pot. The women would put their stuff in a pot and they would split it equally between the two teams. So the men took a bit of a pay hit to make sure the women got paid equally. And in totality together, they're advancing the sport. What they're also doing is like that now puts the pressure on the international body to just make the decision to pay them more. Like this is not even driven by market forces. The women are winning. They are getting more attention. Like people will argue that, oh, nobody watches WNBA games. I'm like, A, you should. They're hella fun. It's a totally different way of playing the sport. Very community oriented, very team player, but also they haven't invested in marketing it, right? Like, do you know when the WNBA is playing? Point aside, that's not, there's choices that these entities are making, and they can make different choices. So the men, in this case in soccer, are stepping up, and they're trying to force the corporate hand.
You know, and I also would say, just in addition to that, the men, you know, making that gesture, making that deal looks generous. Me, platforming the people you mentioned, people of color opening that door, looks like generous and kind.
Everybody wins. Everybody wins.
Yeah, but that's the point I'm saying. Like, I have profited in so many ways because of that. You know, like simply Laura Coates will always take my call. And I have so many needs from her, reasons to call her, you know, not to mention would do anything. It's like the idea is you get something back when you put it out there. You should do things for not for that reason. You should be altruistic. You should do everything you can. But the point is, if you want to be honest, you end up often making more money. Your profile, if you're a pro athlete, these guys are going to look great. There's so many other ways to profit.
Chris Paul lost his game, right? Chris Paul did not do great for the Phoenix Suns last week, but he wore a Brittany Griner shirt. He's a star player. He drew attention to her plight, and he got all sorts of great coverage for it. It's the idea of like what you put out in the world will genuinely come back to you. That's where I'm like all of these haters, it'll come back. All right.
Now, finally, let's get into, believe it or not, Nyyera does have a specialty. She did work at the State Department. She does understand foreign policy and can explain a lot of these things in a way that so many other people can't. And so what do I want to ask you today about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where we're at now, NATO, or is there another region or conflict that you wanted to discuss? What's my question, Nyyera?
There is, we're looking at 3 months into this, right? And the lines have been drawn. Half of Ukraine is in rubble, right? The battle for Kiev, the Ukrainians won that. They withdrew from Mariupol, but there's nothing like, what's the victory for Russia there? They can plant a flag on rubble. And what we're seeing now is Asia, Africa kind of on the sidelines. And we're starting to see, is American attention and support starting to fray a little bit, right? $40 billion of aid to Ukraine that has been compared against the fact that $5 a gallon in gas and the lack of investments in domestic spending. Ironically, though, we are seeing the progressive side of the congressional caucus, the progressive side, even of the Senate, say that this is what we should be doing, right? You would think in that case that it would be the people who need the most in terms of their communities and investment saying, don't send money to Ukraine. And that's not the case. They, like the Black Caucus, for example, America is supposed to stand up for democracy overseas. We can do better at home, but this is what we do, right? We stand up for human rights. It is not okay for one entity to just roll in and take over another. I find that fascinating. And it's Reagan's party is kind of rolling over on it. So I'm interested in seeing, as we head into a midterm election that's polarized, where we have Democrats wanting progressives to lead the fight. You've got on the Republican side, their primary results are showing that you have these, Trumpist election deniers. So the most left and the most right are the ones coming out of party nominations of how Ukraine and this ongoing war plays into the midterm elections, because gas prices aren't going down anytime soon. Inflation's still going to be a problem. Can we build a narrative about who we think we should be on the world stage around national security? Or is it going to come down to dollars and cents? And we just think that we've spent too much?
Okay, I said that was the last question. That's really important, everything you just said. But without following up, as tempting as it is, I just want to ask you real quick, what did you think about any of the outcomes of the elections last night outside of our Board of Education, which we won both seats? But whether it be, Fetterman in Pennsylvania or somewhere else, the future of kind of the Democratic Party movement and the future of the Republican Party movement, would I think it's, I'm kind of more interested in your view in Democrats, but Republican Party has become so extreme. The guy they nominated for governor in Pennsylvania is like a wackadoodle, apparently. And so,
Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania refused to allow any media into his event. He is an avowed election denier. So he believes not only the big lie, but now if he wins the governorship, he'll be able to appoint the Secretary of State.
Right.
That is the person who literally controls the voter rolls.
Right.
Who gets to vote and who doesn't. And that could be in the hands of a guy who does not believe that Joe Biden was president. Problem number one. Now, Fetterman coming forward, he did have a big statewide profile as lieutenant governor. I mean, you've seen the photos of the guy, wearing basketball shorts and sneakers. Yeah. Like, he comes across very run-of-the-mill dude. He's Harvard educated. I don't think it's a shtick the way it is with like Senator Kennedy from, I guess it's Kentucky, who is very
Louisiana, I think.
Yeah, Louisiana. He's very aw shucks, but dude, you went to Oxford, stop.
I mean, one of his colleagues, who was it, another Republican senator, literally called him out during the confirmation hearings, literally saying it's a bit. He's doing a bit.
It's a bit. I don't think it's a bit the way for Fetterman, right? Because I think because he actually talks smart. He doesn't try to dumb himself down, but he's an interesting pick. He is very pro-union, pro-legalization of marijuana and weed. So that definitely hits a demographic, young demographic, working class demographic. He is against, he's pro-Title 42. So he's, not where progressives want to be on immigration at the border. He is also, there's a couple of things where he comes across more on the moderate side of the equation. So the package is progressive. There's some compromise on policy, and maybe that wrapped up with local authenticity is the way forward, right? Connor Lamb was held up as the congressman who won the special election, a way forward for Democrats in the Trump era. And despite his very sincere and genuine outreach to many communities, it seems that he came across to many people as just, that cookie cutter, what we're told a politician should look like from central casting. And it shows that people want something that looks like an outsider. But Pennsylvania is a critical state. Keep an eye on it. It's a state that Trump said he won and he did not. So the election denial, the governor seat there is going to be very important for how 2024 shapes up.
All right, I'm going to let you go. I really appreciate your time, and I can't wait till the next time we get to talk. And I'm positive people who listen to our conversation, or at least my questions and your answers, will love it, as always. Nyyera, thank you so much, as always, for joining me. Go be with your kiddos.
Thank you, Pete. I'm going to go take our dinner now.
All right, Nayyera Haq, everybody. Isn't she great? Wasn't she awesome? Won't it be great if she's on more? Let me know who you'd like to hear. I interview nonfiction authors a lot. I interview, obviously, journalists and academics and listeners of the show. If you are a listener and you want to come on and talk about something that you have expertise in, especially you want to share an important story, let's talk. Email me, standupwithpete@gmail.com. Okay, now it's time to get to my second guest of today's show. He has become one of my closest friends over the past few years. Of course, we met when he was a listener on the old show in SiriusXM. He used to call in. He was just a caller who was so impressive during his calls that I would keep him on for really long, abnormally long periods of time for a caller, sometimes, 10, 20 minutes. I loved talking to Bill Boyle. He's what I call a well-sourced and connected businessman who lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and his son. He's a trusted friend of mine, a source for me who I met, as I said, when he was on the show, a caller who became a friend. He's a voracious reader, a historian of sorts. He's super articulate and thoughtful and moral in my mind. He's a Catholic. He's an Irish Catholic, by the way. I think his analysis is as sharp as anyone you're going to hear on radio or TV. And he's got well-placed friends across the federal government in D.C. who are always talking to him. As far as I can tell, he's not in any kind of three-letter agency. You should follow him on Twitter and park at the garages that he co-owns down there. At Bill B in D.C. on Twitter. Here we go. First of all, I wanted to get your take on local politics and why it matters. You know what I've been involved with here, and it's like the greatest feeling in the world. I feel like it makes such a difference to so many families and thousands of families in my community, what we were able to accomplish. You can see it. You can see the difference it makes overnight, and I think that's not necessarily the same with national elections. What are your thoughts on local politics and why they matter, having grown up the way you did and where you did and your dad and all that?
Yeah, I mean, local politics is everything. It's funny you bring this up because I just got sent a poster of my father's running for the city council in Elizabeth, New Jersey in like 1960. And it's this amazing poster. I'll send you a picture, and it is actually perfect.
Can I include it in the show notes?
Yeah, we can do that. Yeah, I'll send you a picture of it.
Okay.
And local politics is everything. That's where you have the most direct effect on people. It's where you train people in constituent service, which makes them better politicians when and if they move up the food chain into the state or federal level. It creates a political culture that creates consensus, right? And one of our problems right now is that we have too many national politicians who don't have to go through that. You know, Dr. Oz doesn't give a shit about the life of a single mom in Pennsylvania, right?
What is it? He's from or lives in New Jersey?
He has lived in New Jersey forever, yes.
But he ran for Senate in Pennsylvania for, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, I think he rented a room in his sister's house in Bucks County or something.
Oh my God.
It's some sordid bullshit, and in any other normal era it would be laughed at and he would never make it in the race. But again, we're in an era where you don't have to work your way up the food chain. You can sort of short-circuit it if you have money and name recognition. And so local politics is really important, and I can tell you how important it is. The people who wanted to overthrow our government on January 6th of last year, they are turning towards local government because they realized themselves, all these wacky MAGA people, they realized how important it is.
Yeah, and Steve Bannon tells them every day, and others as well. But I mean, that guy deserves a lot of credit for the campaign that we beat. I mean, they were doing all of his big hits, playing all of the hits. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, that's what you have created is a mass movement, but it's a mass movement that doesn't actually have the sort of party structure that we would have thought of, like a fascist movement in the 1930s would have clubs and people hiking camps and this whole sort of infrastructure. These guys are doing it through the internet and through people, on chat rooms. And so it's not quite as totalizing as, or earlier movements like that were. But very much so, yeah, he's giving people a blueprint, and he's creating the Turner Diaries for how to take over your local school board, basically.
Yeah, and medical board and town council, et cetera. Yeah, for sure.
Right. I mean, the good thing about it is these people generally, and I'm talking the MAGA people, so if you like Trump, fuck off, but the MAGA people tend to be really bad at running things, right? They're there mostly for the, I forget who it was, talked about how fascism is so full of entertainment value, and it's so full of this sort of, it heroizes people in their own minds that they are the master race, or they are real Americans, or they are, whatever they happen to be.
Yeah.
And the problem for these folks is that when you then start running a school board and someone slaps a budget down in front of you and says, okay, you have to get this shit done, they tend to not be very good at it. That's the problem with them not having a real organization.
Well, I guess one of my questions, I don't know if you would have any insight on it, but how do we on Earth One get voters and citizens to care about anything from local to anywhere else the way that they on Earth Two get voters and citizens to care about things that literally are not happening and are not problematic and they're not dangerous, and yet they turn out to the board meetings, they turn out to vote against ghosts. We've got to get rid of this thing that doesn't exist, that isn't happening. How do we do that on Earth One?
I think the issue you have is that people in America, many of them, and by the way, the people who make up the MAGA movement and similar movements, they're not poor people. They're actually
a good point.
Sort of higher end paid blue collar people, or on the lower end paid white collar people. What Marx would call the petty bourgeoisie, right? Those folks in America have it really pretty damn good. But what they have is a lack of meaning in their life. That Tom Nichols is famous for talking about this all the time.
Is that right? That's interesting.
This is not a problem you can solve by saying, "Hey, we're going to do program X and initiative Y, and that's going to address your issues," because they're not really concerned about that. They're concerned about identity, meaning. The idea that there's this golden age of America that they belong to and people like me don't, right? Like, that's what this is. This is really a ideological battle by people who are fairly well off and are clearly pretty bored and are often quite ignorant. And they don't have real problems. I mean, I'll give you a good example. How many recent or first or second generation immigrant Americans are MAGA people? It's a distinct minority within that movement, even though many of them are quite conservative. Why? Because they have the immediate memory of, or actual experience of, having to really struggle to get ahead in America. The MAGA people resent those recent immigrants, not because they often have a really huge cultural difference with them. A lot of immigrants in America are pretty conservative. They resent them because they look at them and say, "Oh shit, they're better. They're doing better than me." And being a MAGA person isn't just intellectually lazy. Let me put it that way, right? If you're a MAGA person, you think that, America owes you something, and that you should be given it. I mean, it's a form of welfare for entitled assholes, and it's cultural welfare and it's emotional welfare. They want to feel important and they want to feel that America's theirs. And I look at it like, my father served in the Army. He deserves something for that. I didn't earn any of that, right?
Well, some people would argue that as a result of you being his son, you did.
I mean, all I earned by being his son was that, actually, no, I didn't earn anything. I didn't serve in the Army. It's like, it's like the money my father made. I'm not owed a penny of that. When he kicks the bucket and he gives it all to, charity, it's his money, right? And your cultural importance in America is on the same plane. You're not owed something because your family's been here for a long time. I mean, shit. I had ancestors that fought at Antietam. Am I more American than my wife, who's a Vietnamese refugee? No. That's absurd. That's ridiculous. That's not part of the deal. And so, yeah, that's my long-winded answer to that.
Somebody could. I always think that somebody could, if you really want to get into, I guess, a lazy intellectual argument. I think that's what you said was MAGA thinking that your wife is more American than you because you only know America.
Repeat that last thing because you clipped out for about half that sentence.
Your wife, you could argue, an immigrant is more American than a natural-born American because they know how to appreciate this country more. We don't. If we lived here, if we grew up here, I mean, if we're gonna have a lazy intellectual argument about who's most American,
right,
one might argue the one with the most perspective on how good this country it could be versus where they came from.
Yeah, I mean, I would not make the argument they're better Americans, the folks in my wife's family, but I would certainly make the argument that they really feel it, they see it,
yeah.
They wake up every morning with far more of a, kick, where it's like, man, I'm in a place where there's opportunity, and goddamn it, I'm going to take advantage of it.
Well, what does it mean to be a good citizen of your country? What does it mean to be, a good citizen of your town? We're talking about what makes a good American, because that's another really interesting conversation just about citizenship, about what you contribute. I personally have never felt more reward or more purpose in my entire career. Right. Than I do today after the outcome of this election. I feel very, I don't know what you would call it. I live in Clarkstown. I feel very Clarkstonian.
Yeah, there's I'm sure it's some dumb song or poem or something, but it's like, you only get to keep what you've loved, right? And putting in your labor and your time and your attention, that's what love's about, right? And that's what, and so, if you want to love your country, then get off your ass and do something to make it a better place. Work for it, engage in it, and try to do what's right and to make things work better for everybody. I mean, that makes sense that you loved it, because, I mean, did you ever get handed some sort of gift when you were a kid, the best toy you totally wanted when you were 8 or 9 years old, and you didn't earn it, and honestly, and 2 years later you barely remembered that you received it, right? Whereas that first paycheck you ever worked for when you were 15 years old that you got, that was a big deal, and you never forget that you worked 40 hours and you got what seemed to you a princely amount of money for it.
Yeah,
right?
I didn't forget about not only that first one, but a lot of them. All those minimum wage checks that I got, I remember what they looked like. It felt like hundreds of dollars.
Oh, and you were stunned by it, right? It was like the most amazing thing, and it felt, it gave you value because you put yourself into it. And politics, local politics, general, national politics, all the same.
Let me change gears with you and talk about a couple of other things for sure. Credit to you for, with me and everybody recognizing how much of a flaming asshole Elon Musk is from the very start. You were one of the first people to tell me this guy's a bad person. Tell me about him, because he has reached a pinnacle of evil. Is it today when he basically criticized Joe Biden and applauded Donald Trump? He also has said, I should say, that he doesn't want to see Donald Trump be reelected because he thinks he's too divisive. But yet, what is he doing? Who is he? What is going on with this Twitter thing? And why is he commenting about politics? You would never see any other CEO of an automobile manufacturer, much less cereal, being so outspoken all the time. What is this guy? Talk to me about. Say whatever you want about the great.
I think
Elon.
He's a shit poster. I think he's he grew up in a family that owned I believe an emerald mine in Africa, in South Africa. He grew up with money. He's clearly quite intelligent. He came to the U.S. He started. Oh Jesus, I'm blanking on the company. He started
PayPal.
PayPal. Thank you. So he gets into PayPal. Enormous success. Credit to him. Awesome. Well, then he buys Tesla, puts a ton of effort and money into it, but basically acts like he invented electric cars. Right? He gets into other ventures. The batteries, the roof, solar panels, et cetera, et cetera. And all of them do pretty well, but every single business other than his first always seems to have some pretty bad flaws built into it. He's never created an Amazon. Tesla has all kind. Tesla made most of its money, for instance, selling carbon credits. As you know, I like to go off endlessly about, given my expertise, about how the self-driving is not self-driving and it's really bullshit. SpaceX is amazing, but SpaceX also operates very tightly bound by, NASA and various federal agencies having extraordinarily stringent demands on them to do anything, right? So Musk, when he sort of has adult supervision, can do really good things. But Musk, when he doesn't have adult supervision, when he's in charge, he's kind of a dilettante and a shitposter who, because he's made a ton of money, a lot of it from hype, by the way, people assume he's like a genius and he's a really smart guy. And that's not how the world works. There's a lot of really super successful guys who have been absolute fucking clowns or malign people. And, I've been making references to Elon Musk and Henry Ford recently on Twitter because I'm an asshole and it entertains me. But, Henry Ford was like a promoter of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and an enormous anti-Semite and a pro-fascist, right? Like, Henry Ford actually is a far more revolutionary figure in American industry than Elon Musk ever will be. But he was still an awful fucking guy who had terrible fucking opinions. And Elon Musk is that kind of guy, except he's, the joke is that, is there nothing Elon Musk can't almost do? And that's a running joke in business about, how his companies kind of often approach greatness and never quite make it. And Musk spends his days, on Twitter more than me. And shit, he's running a much bigger set of companies than I am. And he spends his days on there shit posting about all kinds of things. And if you look what he's doing recently, he's clearly made a decision that his Twitter purchase is probably a bad idea.
Right.
And it never made any sense financially in the beginning anyway. He was overpaying enormously for the company.
Right. Like, what? Just unpack that for a second. It never made any sense, so why was he doing it? Going back to the first thing you said, because he's a shit poster? Because he can?
Because he can, because a lot of, the way that his Tesla stock blew up, his value on paper was so out of whack and so ridiculous that, I think that these guys get delusional about their own abilities and their own, perspicacity. They think they're smarter than they are. There are very few Warren Buffetts in this world, right? Most people lose their perspective if things blow up to large enough size. And Musk, I think, sees himself in some way as like a kingmaker, or as, somebody who can be, Musk has this thing that's it's this idea that we have to get off of Earth in order to exist as a species and to continue to exist as a species. And so everything has to be geared towards that. And it's this one, I think, real belief. And he imagines himself to be that millennial figure that will get us there. Hence the rocket company, hence the battery company, hence, he's involved in a thing called, it's the long something or other. It's basically a clock that will operate for like 10,000 years without missing a second. And it's,
oh, wow.
It's called, it's like something the long now, I think it's called. But he's in all these projects where he has this very, millennial, and I don't mean by the generation, but this, millennial in the religious sense idea of his role in the world. And so I think Twitter was his attempt to sort of grab the biggest and most powerful and most influential, public foghorn out there right now. And I think he didn't really care about the money. I think what happened is, though, that he did it and Tesla's stock started declining precipitously. Twitter's stock started going down. And then he's, it's sort of his invasion of Ukraine, right? The beginning was, I'm just going to go buy it. The next thing was, well, now I think he's in the stage of bargaining where he's trying to see if he can knock the price down, right? Which is a strategy that you can do. The SEC is eventually going to come after him for that, by the way. But then the third thing will be to blow the deal up, and he can walk away and say, well, yeah, Twitter sucks, I didn't want it anyway.
The analogy is deeply flawed and insulting to a lot of heroic Ukrainians, I'll say.
Well, I mean, I'm putting Elon Musk in the situation of that he's Putin in this case.
Yeah,
but,
I know.
And by the way, talking about Elon Musk and Ukraine, that's actually brings up a really great story that I think illustrates Elon Musk perfectly. Elon Musk, jumping on Twitter and everywhere else, is telling the Ukrainians, I'm sending you all these Starlink satellite, Wi-Fi and cell, technology so that the Russians can't knock you out and you can keep operating, which he did. And it worked. Except the thing is that Elon Musk did not wake up one morning and say, I'm hooking up Ukraine. The United States government went to him and bought it, and they bought it and delivered it and paid for it all, and paid for it to be set up and are paying to maintain it. Elon Musk didn't do any charity at all for Ukraine on that front. But Ukrainians are convinced he did because, they're in the middle of a war. They're not going to go and look and check, and they believe this guy. But Elon Musk is actually making money off of that during this war, yet he has convinced people that he did something great.
Are you sure about that? That sounds like the worst PR ever. I mean, listen, Lockheed Martin or a tank manufacturer has a contract with the United States government. They get paid to build their tanks. Many people get very wealthy both building them and running these companies.
Right.
But Elon Musk, what you're saying is that he's making it sound like he just sent them there cost-free, but in fact it was an order from the U.S. government. It would be like the CEO of weapon manufacturer,
right.
Saying you're welcome for us sending you all
this. It would be the Javelin guys saying, we've totally hooked you up, Ukraine. Which, by the way, you notice they have never done. Right?
No, I did see the CEO of that company, which I forget which one makes Javelin, on CBS's Face the Nation, and it was in a conversation I thought didn't need to happen and made me real uncomfortable.
Right, but also that guy wasn't saying, I hooked up Ukraine.
Not remotely, but he was promoting the great weapons that he is selling, that he is putting.
Right, and that, I can see why that makes you uncomfortable, but that I think is kosher. He did build it. His company built it.
I don't think it's a segment you do on a network Sunday broadcast that has 39 minutes of content. I think it looks terrible for a lot of reasons. And I think what you do is, if you want to bring him on, then you bring on somebody else to analyze anything about that industry and war and how that might be unethical for a network to do. Maybe.
Well, that I agree with. It's not wrong for the guy from the Moose Javelins. He's doing his job.
No,
Sunday morning
I'm not even saying anything about him. I'm saying,
exactly.
I'm saying CBS and any other major media outlet inviting him on. Of course, he's going to be like, "You want me to come on and talk about the thing I sell on your most watched broadcast?" Exactly. You got it. I mean, and it's not going to be. He knew it wasn't going to be some Andrew Batesovich or some crazy leftist. Not crazy leftist. They would be right. Asking him tough questions. All right. So speaking of which. Do I want to play that Elon Musk clip that you tweeted and talk about his comments, or let's just move on?
Let's move on. Everyone knows I hate him, and they can just follow my Twitter feed, and I'll routinely savage the guy. So, all
right, do you want to have a little fun at the expense of Dave Rubin and Will Cain then?
Oh God, yeah. Oh hell,
it's only 33 seconds. You want to set up the clip?
I would just play it. I think it really speaks for itself.
All right, here's two of my old friends. Seriously, both these guys were good friends of mine. And now, not as much.
And that's why we're seeing people like Bill Maher, Andrew Sullivan, Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald, all of a sudden going, whoa. I mean, all of a sudden it moved so far, so fast, it left a whole wake of people who would have called themselves, I don't even think moderately left. For some of those guys, they would have said they were pretty far left. And now all of a sudden... Glenn Greenwald
was bananas lefty. He was bananas lefty. He used to call me a racist on Twitter all the time. Now he's just repeating everything I said 5 years ago.
Well, all right, so what do you have to say about that, Bill?
He used to call me a racist 5 years ago. Now he's repeating everything I said. I love that because it's really Rubin is a toxic, shitty, terrible MAGA freak, and Greenwald has gone in that direction radically and directly, and I think it's amazing that Rubin is just sort of is just like pointing it out, like now he's like me, right? And Will Cain and these guys, like that list he goes through of the various guys that used to be lefties and are now not lefties. What's hilarious about that is that basically he's talking about a bunch of guys who, if you look at Matt Taibbi, for instance, Matt Taibbi got Me Too'd for his behavior in Moscow when he had his magazine.
Yeah, there were a lot of allegations,
Right. Glenn Greenwald is on Tucker
about
Carlson's
things that he wrote and said, by the way. I don't think he got accused.
Things he wrote and said. Well, there was the time they threw horse semen in the face of an editor of another organization.
Oh, and apparently things he did, because if that's the case, I did not know that.
Yes.
Is that true?
There's a Matt Taibbi, a guy trying to interview him, another journalist trying to interview him in New York years later, met him for a cup of coffee, and Taibbi basically in like the first 5 minutes when the guy said, so you and your, Mark Ames, what did you guys do in Moscow, eventually threw the cup of coffee in this journalist's face in his rage at having to talk about Moscow. Yeah, so these are not great guys, I mean, Glenn Greenwald totally screwed over Reality Winner by leaking the fact that she had leaked documents
Matt Taibbi always struck me as a great guy. And when you tell that story, I kind of am like, well, he must have deserved that cup of coffee in the face because he's such a good guy.
Well, I think Matt Taibbi is a good guy to people who are perceived to be on Matt Taibbi's side. There's a ton of, they were so misogynistic and nasty about
Right.
Female journalists, by the way, who were, in their rag, calling them, fat and disgusting and unfuckable and blah, blah, blah. These are not, whatever, like, your personal experience, my personal experience with people happens to be, you look at their larger behavior, and these guys were always...
No, I live by that. I live by that ethic. I absolutely do. I think that's I was just talking to somebody about that yesterday because we were talking about some of these candidates for board, and the woman was basically saying, I'm like, this guy's the biggest asshole in town. He was on the board before. He's the most divisive guy, super sexist, definitely very racist. We've heard all kinds of racist comments he's made, treats women like terribly. She goes, well, he's always been nice to me.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, well, maybe it's because he doesn't, you're a very strong woman. Maybe he doesn't see you as somebody that he can walk all over. Maybe that's why. Did you think about that?
Exactly. It's, what I was taught as a kid, it was whatever you do to the least of my brothers, right? Not, are you nice to me? It was, how do you treat somebody around me who is weak? And that, if you treat that person badly, then you're a crappy person. And, if you look at, Bill Maher, I don't even need to tell you about Bill Maher, how ridiculous he is, or Andrew Sullivan, who to this day privately tells people that basically, after 1965, U.S. immigration sucks. And that's, of course, because in 1965, they fixed the law so that people who were a little browner than Irish people could start to get into America. Right?
And they've made it, and they've made it, it's such an important point, so much harder. It's just so much harder to get in this country from certainly certain countries.
Right. But so like Will Cain is talking about Matt Taibbi, who has an awful track record when it comes to dealing with women and in various other ways, and, throwing coffee on a journalist who was writing a straight article about him, by the way. Glenn Greenwald, who I won't even give him a hard time for defending Matthew Hale, who was a Nazi. That's whatever. But, Greenwald is a absolutely divisive, nasty figure who loves to promote Tucker Carlson, who is the biggest promoter of great replacement theory in America right now. You have, Bill Maher, who is just like, I won't even go there. And then you have Andrew Sullivan, who thinks that, like, brown people shouldn't be coming to America. That's who is supposed to be the people that were like, man, they used to be leftists. And now, they've decided the Democrats are too crazy. And that's not, it's actually the reverse, right? I mean, the Democratic Party has moved a little bit to the left, but virtually any research anyone has done has shown the Democrats have moved to the left about a notch or two, and Republicans have moved very significantly to the right. So the way that whole clip is framed, it's like, oh my God, the left has gone crazy. That's bullshit. Dave Rubin used to be a very, very liberal guy.
Sure, I know
Will Cain used to be just to the right of the middle. You knew him really well.
He was very liberal on everything except for Israel. And,
that's right.
and to anything that was anti-Arab. He was always clearly very anti-Arab, Muslim,
right.
All that, and very pro-Israel. So whatever you think about that, I think that is on the right. But everything else, he's a gay guy and a comedian and, liberal, very liberal on everything else. Reasonable. I knew him well, Bill. I mean, I tried to save his job at Sirius. He had a show once a week, and I thought he was good.
Will Cain was a very moderate conservative, not very long ago. And the bottom line is these guys are, they're rube farming. They're out there because they see where the money is, and the money that you can really make in the media sphere these days is to sell bullshit to right-wingers who are dumb enough to send you $30 a month to your Substack, right? I mean,
yeah, well said. But though we do need to be clear, you're talking about Dave Rubin and Will Cain and also the Overton window in terms of political spectrum in the United States over a certain period of time, whatever you want to put it. But I'm saying it's probably it's not more important. The point I would make is look at legislation. So has Republican legislation moved further to one extreme than than Democratic legislation? I think that's probably a better framing. Although, and I'll also say about that connection, the legislation that comes out of Republican state houses and the U.S. Congress is heavily influenced by Will Cain's take, by Tucker Carlson's take, by Mark Levin's take, Rush Limbaugh. And that is not the case on the left.
No, I mean, it's we're in a period of of reactionary populism in ascendance, right? And that's what those guys represent. That's where the money is, frankly. I don't think either one of those guys on that clip could give a shit about the politics in and of itself.
Say it again, just because you actually just said exactly what Bannon did the other day, and I want you to actually just make that a real fine point. We are in an era of ascendant populism. Unpack that, please. That's what Bannon said. He said, we are ascending. Our nationalism, the clip should probably be played everywhere, by the way, what Bannon said.
Right.
Go ahead.
I mean, it basically comes down to it's reactionary populism, which is these guys hate whatever somebody like me likes, right? So they hate people that are different than them. They hate people who will say, yeah, maybe America isn't always that great. They hate people who are for change, period. I mean, it's this drawing in sort of a reactionary thing that anything that I don't feel comfortable with is per se evil, right? And there's no logic to it. It's a thing that happens in societies periodically, goes through phases of it. It doesn't mean fascism necessarily, but it definitely it's a rejection of the sort of small L liberal state and society.
Here, let me play the clip of Bannon, which I've never done, I don't think, and it's 2 minutes. So whenever you want me to press stop just to make or unpack or argue a point, just tell me stop, and I will. Here we go. This is this monster who is wearing 4 shirts, and he's red. He's very, very red-faced. And he has a sign over his shoulder that says, there are no conspiracies, but there are no coincidences, or something like that. Anyway, here we go.
All the morning shows are all over Tucker Carlson and a few others about the replacement theory. They seem...
Oh, yeah. First he talks about replacement theory, which I do want you to comment on. So tell me when you want me to hit stop.
To miss the point. And here's what we're not going to back off on. This is, and for people who follow this show from day one, we are...
That's me. I follow it all the time, by the way. I should just mention. Huge fan. I got the mug.
Our inclusive nationalism, right?
They're inclusive nationalists. Sorry, we have
said from day one and supported from day one and work every day from day one. It's Hispanic Americans in the Rio Grande Valley and South Texas that are leaving the Democratic Party in droves. It is African Americans in droves that understand the lies and
Okay, the African Americans and Hispanics in the Rio Grande Valley leaving the Democratic Party in droves is ridiculous, risible, and not true. We've had one election where Democrats had problems in the Rio Grande Valley. We also had a problem with the same chunk of voters in 2004, and in the next round they came back Democrats. These guys are really good at cherry picking small bits of data and pretending that is like the harbinger of a new era. Okay. And so
we'll look up that point, and I've heard what you've heard there. Hear more.
Representations of the Democratic Party. We are inclusive nationalism and participatory populism.
Stop.
Okay?
So they're not inclusive nationalists. Inclusive nationalism is that you are willing to accept people in the country who are not like you, right? And I shouldn't even say that. Inclusive means you accept people who are not like you in your same, what you consider to be your community. Nationalism, by definition, is the opposite of that. You can't have a nation without excluding, right? Unless it includes so many people that it doesn't mean anything anymore. You can be patriotic, and that can be a positive association of a set of ideas with your nation, and patriotism actually can pull anybody in. It's just the idea that people are accepting your values and your sense of what the country is, and agreeing with them and willing to go along with them.
There's a big difference between patriotism and nationalism, certainly how they're seen historically.
I mean, just as a matter of fact, it's different. Okay. You know, the Nazis didn't call themselves patriots or the German equivalent. They were members of the Volk and of the German nation. And by definition, when you look at it in that way, you have to draw distinct borders. And Bannon can say whatever he wants, but in the end, the people from Mexico that are coming over the border, the quote-unquote illegals, are they any different culturally? Or are they at all really different culturally from the Mexicans who live just north of that border for a generation or two? Almost not at all.
Right.
Culturally and in religion and everything else, they're almost exactly the same thing.
Yep.
So if he was really a inclusive nationalist and those Latino folks in the Rio Grande Valley were totally Jake with him, why would he give a shit what side of the river they were born on or got their, citizenship from?
I'm going to play more because I really am fascinated and super interested in your responses to him. And when I watch these clips, I get outraged and I don't know exactly what the arguments are or how to respond. And so let me hit play again if you'll tolerate it, Bill.
Shoot.
And I should mention at the end of the clip, I'm surprised more people aren't talking about this. He turned into a bat and flew away. I thought that would have gotten more.
And we're winning. This is about the sovereignty of the United States, and this is about the citizens of the United States, Ukrainians. And so, so this is not about race. This is about
there's an edit there. Here it is.
American citizenship. This is about the value of your citizens. The Biden administration and the radical left, as seen by Morning Mika and Morning Joe and that whole crowd at the New York Times and the whole crowd at MSNBC, are about ceding the sovereignty of this nation, whether it's to the WA.
So that whole pitch is, I love it how he says sovereignty and citizenship. You know what a sovereign citizen is, right?
Nice. Hatch. That's one of the far-right militia groups in America.
Exactly.
Like
I'm not sure if he's doing it unconsciously or consciously, but it's clearly there, right?
I bet he's doing it consciously.
Right.
Let's not forget who you're talking to. The guy who sat at the end of his show looking at his call screen, seeing what he was seeing, and then judging why he chose the call he did. It was a fascinating experience for any host or anybody. But Go ahead. Sovereign citizen. Go ahead.
So all of that is great replacement theory, just garbled out in words that don't quite say what we think of it as. That you're giving your sovereignty and your citizenship and your the sovereignty of the country. The idea that the U.S. would lose sovereignty over itself by illegal immigration coming into the country means that we lost sovereignty of the country in like 1815. I mean, virtually, every state in the Union on the East Coast had rules about how much money you were supposed to have when you came into the United States, all the way back. Go back to the 1840s, 1830s.
There's a requirement for you to come into the country. You had to have a bag of cash.
You have to have something. Each state had its own rules, but there were rules that were, whether money you brought with you or various other chattels or whatever. Of course, almost nobody showed up with that, right? And they just got waved on in. I mean, in technical terms, basically everybody who came here, all of my relatives certainly were illegal, right? Technically speaking.
The Irish.
Did we lose sovereignty of the country? Well, I got to tell you something. The KKK in the 1920s certainly thought we had, right? It's why they were marching on my grandfather's front lawn, threatening to burn his portrait of Al Smith, the Democratic candidate, in 1928, right? I mean, what he's bringing up, what Bannon's bringing up, is a very old trope. It's, Charles Dana had a satirical picture of Catholic bishops crawling onto the beaches of America, and their hats, those long hats, were open like alligators' jaws as they crawled onto the beach. And he was making fun of the know-nothings and the anti-immigration people back a century or more ago, right? I mean, this is really old stuff, and he's just dressing it up in fancy language. And that's Bannon's deal, right? Bannon basically takes the language that you would get from like a self-help or a like Malcolm fucking Gladwell book that you would find in the airport, and he uses that sort of language to dress up really old school shit like, the KKK or the know-nothing saying, if you let them foreigners in here, it's going to ruin America. He's doing exactly the same thing, and there's no real difference.
Yeah. And yet you're absolutely right. It's not unlike, taking this. There's a whole industry of that. There's an entire industry of self-helpers, all of which, by the way, I love. I'm not even criticizing, from Eckhart Tolle to what Dan Harris is doing with his amazing podcast, just reinterpreting Eastern philosophies in new ways, including, even early American, philosophers or nature writers or something, taking their stuff and helping us understand how to utilize it to find balance in our lives, whatever, happiness, ease suffering. And so that's what Bannon's doing, just with the
he's stealing that sort of, it's language designed to make something that is primal and crude and simple sound technical and scientific.
Well, let's let him keep doing it, because I actually love this, but I really have to get your response to this one point that I hope after all this he does make, but even if he doesn't, here it is.
WHO, of which we're going to fight today. We're going to have Michelle Bachmann and Frank Gaffney about the webinar this afternoon, whether it's seen to the WHO or whether it's allowing an invasion on the southern border. And no, we are not backing off a 1 inch, because inclusive nationalism and participatory populism is what's changing this country. And that's what they're freaking out about. And this is why we're going to win 80 to 100 seats in the House of Representatives. This is why we're going to flip the United States Senate. This is why we're going to take over every school board in the nation. This is why we're going to take over every electoral board, elections board in the nation. This is why we're going to take over every medical board in this nation. This is why we're going to take over state legislatures and DAs and attorney generals and secretaries of state and governors. And we're not going to stop. We are ascendant.
He said we are ascendant there at the end.
Yeah.
Right when you said stop, I just want to, I'm going to, because that's the point he made. And let me just play that. And I actually have something to say here.
Governors, and we're not going to stop. We are ascendant, and we are not going to stop at all.
I need to take that clip, and I need to say everything he said exactly that he said it, because we actually did take over the Board of Education. Right. That motherfucker is so effective. You might disagree. I think he's the most effective communicator in all of Earth 2, right-wing Landia. He is the best, and we have to stop him. That's what we did yesterday for the next 3 years here in Clarkstown, but we need the same type of commentators that are just as passionate but have more symmetry in their face.
Yeah, less blotches, yeah. I would say this, that if he was really effective, he would not be activating people like you so much. I think that the mistake that guys like him make,
he wouldn't be activating people like me.
Yes, you're out there wanting to, fighting exactly what he's doing, and and you're not alone in that. I think that what the Bannon people have done is, by their extremism, they've done the opposite of what McConnell has always tried to do. McConnell is incremental, everything's reasonable, even when it's not. The tone is, blah. He's getting what he wants while looking like he's following the rules and looking like he is, just going along.
I see what you're saying. What you're saying, it sounds like what I'm hearing is, if he was actually more effective, he would be in the shadows and he would be working at ALEC, American Legislative Exchange, the conservative group. But I think I'll just say this, and I would love to be wrong, and I think he is. I think he's doing what he's doing on media because he loves it. He really does enjoy it for the reasons I do, but also because he's making a shitload of money. And so he's just like Mark Levin or Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson. He could care less about what actually happens in the country. He's making a lot of money having fun doing it. But I also do think he does care, which is why he's actually, and maybe I'm wrong, but he's doing all those things in the dark shadows as well, influencing legislation at every level, literally taking over the boards. I do think that.
Well, so they're having an effect for sure, but here's the thing. Excuse me. None of these guys are creating this out of whole cloth. They're not creating a movement any more than Hitler did or anyone else did. They are catching a wave.
Oh,
so what they're doing is they're reacting to...
What does that matter?
Well, it matters because I don't think...
The movement started. Trump started it. Wherever it started, it doesn't matter. These guys are perpetuating it. They're fanning the flames. They're growing.
They're fanning the flames because that's where the money is. I don't think
but it's growing.
I think we'll see,
Wait, Bill, let me just push back hard. Don't you think that the Buffalo shooter, was directly influenced by Bannon or by Tucker Carlson, who learned his great replacement theory from Steve Bannon? Bannon sold it way before Tucker did.
I do, but that's not the same thing as these guys taking over the country. It's different.
That's a great point, and I'm glad to hear you. Yes. As horrific as that violent act is it equivalent to them taking over every school board, every state house?
I mean, the violent act means nothing in the long term, except in that it creates revulsion and it messes up their plans. I mean, it's not
Well, it creates tremendous fear in communities that then react violently, potentially themselves. I'm not talking about the black community. I'm talking about historically. That's what it does.
Well, again, Pete, in the late 60s, early 70s, this country was vastly more violent than it is now.
Right.
I think that people need some perspective on that. And we are far too violent right now, from my perspective, and I hate it. But that is not to say that things are as bad as they have been in multiple instances in American history. And as I told you, my grandfather having to sit there with a baseball bat in his front lawn as a group of guys filed past his house to make sure they didn't burn it down. Right? And he was a well-connected, tough guy, and they knew they couldn't fuck with him. But I haven't had to stand in front of my house with a baseball bat, and most people don't.
But you have you have your son out there.
Well, exactly. Yeah. No, I've got all my parking guys. That's all I need.
He's got one of his servants in front of his moats. Go ahead. Sorry.
Exactly. But
you haven't had to do that, obviously.
No, and I mean the level of violence, just statistically and empirically, is not what it used to be 40 years ago.
Even in the city, by the way, it's not. I mean, you say that, but you live in D.C. There's still a lot of violence, even in your neighborhood. You've told me about it, but it doesn't. You're saying the perspective is not even remotely what it has been.
Well, our problem these days is there's a lot more guns than there used to be, and I'll give you a good example that puts it in perspective. D.C. at its height in the 80s had, I believe, just under 500 murders a year, with 500,000 people. Right now, people in D.C. are flipping out about crime. Our murder rate's about 162 a year, I believe, last year, somewhere in that range, and we have 750,000 people here. So we have basically a third of the murders with half again the size of the population. And people think it's absolutely awful. And it is awful. But realistically, is it the same as it was back in the quote-unquote bad old days? Not at all. It was much worse back then. And I think that... Is it
mostly gang-related, that kind of stuff?
Back then, D.C. was very poor, and there were big outdoor drug markets, pre-cell phones, right? In order to sell drugs, it was important to control territory. Once cell phones come along, the territory no longer matters because people can just call the burner phone and figure out where to drive by to pick them up.
Holy shit, I have never heard that. I've been so out of the loop on that subject, which I used to read and follow
you
a
will
lot,
not hear
and
that
then
anybody.
Live and experience with.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's who writes. I want to talk to somebody who writes about modern day black market drug sales.
I've never read it anywhere. I talk to my buddies in the police department, and that's my conclusion that has come out of talking to police officers who, for them it's so obvious they don't say it to you, and then you have a longer conversation and they're like, oh yeah, of course, cell phones.
Oh right, sure, and it's certainly obvious for the guys who sell and buy the drugs. They know.
Yeah, I mean drug markets still exist in this town, but there's no point in trying to physically take them over anymore because there's no, they can just move. And then on top of that, obviously, surveillance cameras also make it idiotic to stay in one place and have...
That's a great point. Yeah.
Right. So there's structural things that have changed why there were turf battles back then that there aren't now. Our murder rate was down to like 80, 90 a year. And then the laws on guns kept getting wider and wider. We were forced to allow guns in D.C., legalized guns in D.C. by the feds. Yeah. And now we're at a situation, as I told you, I should be circumspect about this, but there was a shooting in my neighborhood where, it was a guy with a permit, and there's no way that shooting would have happened if he didn't have a permit for the gun.
D.C. versus Heller.
Yeah. And so it's just stupid. We're in it. We've armed ourselves to the teeth, and now we're shocked that people are getting shot.
I don't know where we were, and if there needs to be on the Bannon thing. And I mean, was there anything else about that?
Just that Bannon is a disgusting, blotchy sack of crap, and I honestly don't have any real respect for him. I think that he is someone who is a good at making some sort of plausible sounds that make him seem like some sort of sage on this stuff. And he really doesn't have a lot to say. I mean,
he talked his way right into the White House.
Yeah, I mean, and of course the people he was talking to were clowns themselves, right? So
well, yeah, but that's still he was. I mean, you can ridicule it all you want. He was in power of the most
what's interesting
powerful military in the world, Steve
Bannon.
Bannon.
But what's interesting about all those guys,
I'm giving him too much credit there, but obviously,
right. But what's interesting about all those guys that I think gets it my contempt is that had they really been serious people with real serious skills, they would have gotten a lot more done that they wanted to get done.
I think they did get a lot done,
No,
Bill.
they were so ineffective, Pete. They were so ineffective.
What they did in Israel was something that no administration would have ever even considered have doing or allowing to happen. They
barely made a dent in, what Trump wanted to do in various ways just never happened because he couldn't get it off the ground.
He got 3 justices appointed to the Supreme Court, but that's not
again,
policy.
That's not the Trump people.
Right.
That's the
Federalist Society.
That's
but
Leonard Leo and Mitch McConnell doing that.
Right.
And so these guys really, they wanted to, Bannon had all these ideas of they were going to do this enormous road structure. Remember the roads? They were going to fix all the roads, and that was going to be like the New Deal for conservative populism, and it never even remotely got off the ground. Right? I mean, they were not effective. And, let me put it this way. They were no Nazis. Okay? Let me put it that way.
Yeah. They were no Nazis.
Yeah.
What do you want to say about where we're at, what's going on, an update, if you will? Give us a dispatch from the Donbass. Let us know how the invasion, who's winning, Bill?
So the Ukrainians are winning, very definitely right now. Russia is in a really bad spot because it's too weak to win. It's increasingly going to be too weak to hold on to what it's grabbed. But it's also too weak. Yes. But it's also too weak to, as internally, in the domestic sense, as a regime, to sue for peace. So Putin and his folks are really in a bind because they can't go back to Russians and say, this was all we fucked up, we're done. That could overthrow the government quite easily. They can't even do a general mobilization because that also might bring the government down. They can't they're not strong enough to force China to help them more, India to help them more. They can't even stop Finland and Sweden from joining NATO, right? They're in a really weak position, and they're stuck in this war that they can't really pull out of now. And so because they can't do a general mobilization, for instance, they can't throw another 150,000 men into this war, which, by the way, if they'd done it, would have only happened 6 months from now, right? So they're going to be trying to figure out, sneaky ways to pull more guys into that war, but they're never going to be able to load up with another army like the size of the one that they sent in. And so the Ukrainians are going to slowly but surely, and not even very slowly, have better, more lethal, more accurate Western weapons. They're going to continue to have the really amazing intelligence and logistics work that the U.S. can provide them. They're going to end up with something like 1 million men under arms when you include, every farmer who's been given a rifle. And Russia's going to be trying to cover the distance of the Western Front in World War I, which went from Switzerland all the way to the English Channel, right? That is the length of the line the Russians are going to have to try to defend. And they're going to be trying to do it with about 160,000 men. 50,000 of them don't want to be there. Really, really, really don't want to be there. And have shitty old rifles and were kind of pushed into the line. And say the Ukrainians can put against that. 1 million men is one thing, but you need to defend a lot of space. So say the Ukrainians have also 150,000 men. They can put them wherever they want to, whereas the Russians have to cover everything. I think the Russians are just going to get picked off. They're going to get one by one, get pushed back. And we're going to have a real interesting situation, I think, by the end of the summer, where they're just starting to lose big chunks of space and of conquered territory. And I think it's going to be really interesting. And I don't think it goes nuclear, by the way, ever, because there's nothing in nuclear. There's nothing, Putin drops one tactical nuclear weapon to try to scare everybody, right? Okay, so he's blown up 8 miles of space. The Ukrainians have this really broad and deep defensive structure. You can't nuke it out of existence with 1 or 2 attacks. What that also would do is that India, for instance, and China especially, are no first-use states. It's a deep part of their military and political doctrine overseas and has been for 50-plus years. China will, whatever small things they're doing for Russia right now, that will end definitively at that point. Russia will be a pariah state for the next 50 years if they do it. So doing a small nuke...
And have the Chinese made that clear?
No, China's doing they're signaling to the Russians that they're buddies in domestic Chinese propaganda. In their international propaganda, they're saying, we just want this all to settle down. This is bad. This isn't good for anybody. But America is a big imperialist and they suck. What they're privately doing is they've slashed their trade to Russia by 25%. They're not buying a lot of Russian oil. Chinese oil companies are going to cancel their contracts the minute that the European and American insurance commissions say that you can't insure Russian oil, which is going to happen soon. And when the contracts, Sinopec is the big Chinese oil company. When their contracts are up with Russia, they're not going to renew, because if they renew, they'd have to accept payment in rubles, which they don't want, because it's not worth anything. So Russia's situation keeps on getting compacted more and more and more. And, as a rule of thumb, when you're looking at a war, the way you look at it is, if one side's options are expanding, they're winning. If another side's options are contracting, they're losing. And if you look at Russia right now, their only options are like maybe a tactical nuke. I mean, it's not like they can attack Sweden. They can't. They don't have 500,000 men to throw back at Kiev. They just don't have anything to do other than to kind of hold on. Where if you look at those Russian attacks in the Donetsk basin, well, Ukraine has just cleared out everything around Kharkiv. And if they go about another 30 miles east from where they are on the train lines that supply all those Russian soldiers to the south that are attacking in the Donetsk. In other words, the Ukrainians are cutting off their supplies. While the Russians are trying to do this offensive, they're going to find themselves out on a limb with no bullets and no beans. So, when you look at it, you see the Ukrainians doing these strategic things and, letting the Russians sort of wear themselves out on defenses where they're actually taking territory that matters, because they have extra men and they have choices and they can decide to do things that'll help them win. Whereas the Russians are kind of just pounding on this door. They tried to take Kiev, they couldn't. They went to a smaller idea, which was to try and take the Donbass, they couldn't. Then they went to a smaller idea. We're just going to try to take the Severodonetsk, which is where they are now. They're not. And the Russian attempted bite keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller as a piece of the Ukraine.
Right.
So, there's no big, insight into what I'm telling you. You just look at how their ambitions keep getting wound into a smaller place, whereas the Ukrainians are taking back territory every day. And
really?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, follow my Twitter feed and you'll see I post maps that people put.
I follow your Twitter feed.
Yeah, there's a couple guys that I post their maps. There's a guy called Jomini of the West. It's Jomini, JOMINIW on Twitter. And every couple of days he puts up an incredibly great sort of maps of the theater and what's happening. And, read him. He gives amazing analysis of this stuff. And so Russia's losing. And, you read Julia Yaffe, by the way, does not necessarily agree with me. She thinks Russia can keep this going forever. I don't.
I was going to ask some other perspectives if yours is, but I just assume now. Okay, so let's go ask her now. And I don't believe anything you said because you told me that.
You should talk to her. I think she and I talk. So I don't think that she thinks I'm necessarily wrong. I think it's more that she thinks it's going to take longer. Right. But what happens with Julia talks to the pros, and she talks to this guy Michael Kaufman and U.S. government agency guys, and I feel like those folks are burdened with too much knowledge of how things went in the past.
But I'm sure she talks to the same type of people you're talking to as well. No,
I don't think she does. No, I think she talks to she's a reporter, so she'll go to the Pentagon spokesman or the general of the Pentagon in charge of this. She's talking to much more official sources than I am.
She's a reporter. What are you?
I'm just a dude who likes to drink beer and talk about Ukraine.
Bill Boyle, everybody, at Bill B in D.C., and I really appreciate you. That was just a fascinating conversation, as always. Thank you.
Thank you, buddy. All right,
there he goes, at Bill B in D.C. on Twitter. A great Twitter feed and a great guest who is a regular here on the show and a very good friend to me, a mentor and a confidant who I have great admiration and respect for. Okay, always good to question him, by the way. You don't have to agree. He always sounds pretty right in his tone. He's got that affect, right, that he says at the end, that Rachel mad I wish. Yeah, he's going to be mad at me for comparing her. No, that syntax thing, the ending a sentence with right, which kind of makes you think, well, yeah, I guess, even if you just said that the sun is going to burn out tomorrow, right? Yes. I love Bill. I love his insights, and he always is just so interesting and brilliant on such a wide range of issues off the top of his head. Great conversation, and as well with Nayyera Haq. Man, have we done some good shows this week. Guests have been so fantastic. Who do you want to hear next week? I'm looking forward to your ideas and seeing you tonight at tonight's Hangout. We'll be back, of course, tomorrow. I didn't mean to skip the Friday show. I think Ophira and Christian will be joining me. You can see us all, by the way, June 11th, Fairfield, Connecticut. Fairfield, Connecticut. We're coming to you, all three of us, 2 shows, 7 and 9, the Saturday, June 11th. Hope to see you there if you're anywhere around Connecticut. That's it. That's all I got for you. By the way, that bumper music earlier was from John Carroll on the way in at the opening of the show. So, John, thank you for that. Always great, and singing us out as he always does. Be the change you want to see, folks. Now's the time. Talk to you tomorrow.
Stand up, show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.